My stepsister wore my wedding gown to her bachelorette party and told me that sisters share everything. So I added handcuffs to her accessories. My stepsister Jade had this obsession with everything I owned where she'd help herself to my belongings, then act confused when I got upset because we're family, and family shares everything, right? It started when our parents got married 10 years ago and Jade moved into our house. She'd go into my room when I wasn't home and take whatever she wanted. My clothes, my jewelry, my makeup, even my prescription retainer. When I put a lock on my door, she cried to her mother that I was excluding her and making her feel unwelcome in her own home. Her mother made me remove the lock because it was creating division in our blended family. Jade would wear my clothes to school, and when people complimented her, she'd say, "Oh, this old thing, I've had it forever." She'd use my expensive skincare until it ran out, then act shocked when I asked her to replace it. She had no concept of boundaries, and her mother enabled it by saying, "Sharing is what sisters do." When I got engaged, Jade immediately asked to try on my ring because she wanted to see how it felt to wear something so beautiful. When I said no, she pouted for weeks, telling everyone I was selfish. She tried to convince my fiancé Luke that I had trust issues, and maybe he should reconsider marrying someone who couldn't even share with family. At every wedding planning appointment, Jade inserted herself, claiming she needed to be involved because she was the maid of honor, even though I'd never asked her to be. She told vendors she was co-planning the wedding and tried to change my choices. When I picked burgundy bridesmaid dresses, she called the shop and changed them to pink. The dress shopping was a nightmare. Jade insisted on trying on every dress I tried on. When I finally found my perfect dress, a vintage designer gown that cost $8,000, Jade immediately said she needed to try it on too. The consultant said no because it had already been fitted to me, but Jade threw such a fit that her mother pressured me to let her try it. She wore it for 20 minutes, taking photos and saying maybe she'd get one just like it. I kept my dress at Luke's apartment because I didn't trust her. I gave her mother strict instructions that it was off limits. 2 weeks before my wedding, Jade announced she was getting married too. She'd been secretly dating some guy named Brett for 3 months, and they decided to get married the month after my wedding. Her bachelorette party was planned for the weekend before my wedding. The night of Jade's bachelorette party, I was at home addressing last-minute invitation issues when my phone started blowing up. My cousin Francis had sent me photos from the party. I opened them and nearly threw my phone across the room. Jade was wearing my wedding dress at her bachelorette party. My $8,000 vintage designer wedding dress that was supposed to be locked in Luke's apartment. She was drinking in it, dancing in it, grinding on strangers in it. There were photos of her on a party bus surrounded by drunk women spilling drinks while wearing my dress. There were photos of her in a club with the dress hem dragging on the sticky floor. There were photos of red wine stains down the front. I called Luke frantically and he checked his apartment. The spare key was missing from under the mat and my dress was gone. I drove to downtown where Francis said they were bar hopping and found them at the third club. Jade was on the dance floor in my destroyed dress, which now had multiple stains, rips in the vintage lace, and what looked like vomit on the train. I pushed through the crowd and grabbed her arm. She smiled and slurred, "Oh hey sis, isn't this dress amazing? I wore it for good luck since I'm getting married too now." I dragged her outside where her entire bachelorette group followed. "I said you stole my wedding dress for your trashy bachelorette party. Look at it, it's destroyed." Jade laughed and said, "It's just a dress, stop being so dramatic. Besides, you should be honored I wanted to wear it." Her friends started defending her, saying it was sweet that she wanted to include me in her celebration. That's when Luke arrived with the police. He'd called them after confirming the break-in at his apartment. The officers asked Jade how she obtained the dress, and she said it was a family dress that we shared. I showed them the receipt with only my name, the photos from my fitting, and the texts where I explicitly told her mother the dress was off limits. They asked Jade again, and she admitted she took the spare key and borrowed it without asking, but insisted that's what sisters do. The officer said that's called breaking and entering plus grand theft given the dress value. They arrested Jade right there in front of her entire party. Her mother called me screaming that I'd ruined Jade's life over a piece of fabric, but I said Jade broke into an apartment and stole $8,000 worth of property, then destroyed it. The best part came when Jade's fiancé Brett found out what happened. Brett showed up at the police station about an hour after they took Jade away in the patrol car. I was sitting in the waiting area with Luke when Brett walked through the doors looking completely lost and confused. He went straight to the front desk and asked where his fiancée was, and why she got arrested at her bachelorette party. The officer at the desk called over one of the cops who had been at the club, and they took Brett into a side room to explain what happened. Through the window, I could see the officer showing Brett something on his phone, and Brett's whole face changed. His mouth dropped open, and he kept shaking his head like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. The officer was pointing at the phone screen and talking, and Brett just looked more and more horrified with every second. When they brought Jade out from the back, she was still in my destroyed wedding dress, but now she had mascara running down her face and her hair was a mess. Brett stared at her and asked if what the officer said was true, and did she really break into an apartment and steal a wedding dress? Jade started crying harder and saying it was supposed to be fun, and she didn't think it was a big deal because we're sisters. Brett asked her how breaking into someone's apartment could possibly be fun, and Jade just kept crying and saying I was overreacting. I watched Brett's face go from confused to angry, to just completely done with the whole situation. He asked Jade if she understood that she committed actual crimes and she could go to jail, and Jade said I was being dramatic and her mom would fix everything. Luke and I got called back to give our official statements about the break-in and the dress. We sat in a small office with one of the officers and went through everything step by step. I showed him the text where I told Heidi the dress was off limits and she acknowledged it. I showed him the receipt with only my name on it proving I paid $8,000 for the dress. I showed him the photos from my fitting where the dress was perfect, and then the photos Francis sent of Jade wearing it covered in stains and rips. Luke explained how he discovered his spare key was missing, and the dress was gone from his locked closet. The officer took notes on everything and said that based on the value of the dress and the forced entry, this would likely be charged as felony burglary and grand theft. He said the district attorney would review the case, but with this much evidence, they'd probably file charges within a few days. I asked what would happen to Jade, and he said she'd be arraigned and could face up to 3 years in prison if convicted. The whole time we were giving our statements, I could hear Jade crying in the holding cell down the hall. Part of me felt bad, but mostly I just felt angry that she destroyed something so important to me, and still thought she was the victim. We were finishing up our statements when I heard screaming in the lobby. Heidi had arrived at the station and she was yelling at the front desk officer demanding to see her daughter. When she saw me walking out of the office, she came right at me screaming that I was destroying Jade's life over a piece of fabric. She said I was selfish and vindictive, and how could I do this to family right before my wedding? Everyone in the station was staring at us, and I just stood there calmly and said Jade broke into an apartment and stole $8,000 worth of property, then destroyed it while drunk. Heidi said it was just a dress and I could buy another one, and I was being petty. I told her that Jade committed multiple crimes and I was simply letting the legal system handle it the way it would handle anyone who broke into someone's home and stole their belongings. Heidi started crying and saying I was tearing the family apart and my dad would be so disappointed in me. I said my dad would be disappointed that his stepdaughter is a thief, and his wife enabled her for 10 years. Heidi called me a horrible person and said she'd never forgive me for this. I walked away and sat back down next to Luke while Heidi went to talk to the officers about getting Jade released. Brett found me in the waiting area and asked if we could talk for a minute. We went outside and he immediately apologized for everything Jade did. He said he had no idea she was like this, and if he'd known, he never would have gotten engaged to her. I told him it wasn't his fault, and he couldn't have known since they'd only been dating 3 months. Brett said that Jade told him we were super close sisters who shared everything and did everything together. He said she made it sound like we had this amazing relationship, and she was so excited to officially be sisters through our marriages. Now he was realizing that basically everything Jade told him about me and our relationship was a complete lie. He asked if it was true that Jade had been taking my stuff for years, and I said yes and gave him a few examples. Brett looked sick and said he was starting to see a pattern of lying and manipulation that he'd missed before. He said Jade told him her family was wealthy, and she had a trust fund, which is why she didn't need to work much. Now he was wondering if she'd been stealing from me to fund her lifestyle. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just told him I was sorry he had to find out this way. Brett said he needed to do some serious thinking about their engagement and thanked me for being honest with him. The police released Jade on bail around 3 in the morning. Heidi paid the bail money and immediately rushed Jade out of the station. Jade was still wearing my destroyed dress because she didn't have any other clothes with her. I watched them leave through the station windows and saw Heidi helping Jade into her car. Brett was still there sitting in his car in the parking lot. He didn't go with them or try to talk to Jade. He just sat there for about 20 minutes staring at his steering wheel. Finally, he started his car and drove away in the opposite direction from where Heidi and Jade had gone. Luke and I drove home exhausted and angry and sad about everything that happened. I couldn't sleep that night even though it was almost 4 in the morning by the time we got home. I kept thinking about my dress and how it was completely destroyed, and my wedding was only 12 days away. Luke held me while I cried, but I wasn't even crying about Jade getting arrested. I was crying about losing the perfect vintage dress I'd spent months searching for. That dress was exactly what I'd imagined wearing on my wedding day, and now it was covered in wine stains and vomit and torn lace. I'd have to find a new dress in less than 2 weeks, which felt impossible. Luke kept saying we could postpone the wedding if I needed more time, but I refused to let Jade's actions change our date. We'd already paid deposits and guests had booked flights and hotels. I wasn't giving her that kind of power over my life. Eventually, I fell asleep from pure exhaustion around 6 in the morning. My phone rang at 9 and it was my dad calling. He asked if I could meet him for coffee without Heidi there because he needed to hear my side of what happened. I was running on 3 hours of sleep, but I agreed to meet him at a coffee shop near his office. When I got there, my dad looked terrible. He had dark circles under his eyes and looked like he hadn't slept either. He hugged me and said he needed to understand everything that happened because Heidi's version didn't make sense. We sat down and he asked me to start from the beginning. I pulled out my phone and showed him everything. I showed him the photos Francis sent of Jade wearing my dress at the bachelorette party. I showed him the photos of the dress covered in stains and rips. I showed him the texts where I explicitly told Heidi the dress was off limits and stored at Luke's apartment. I showed him Heidi's response acknowledging that she understood. I showed him the receipt proving I paid $8,000 for the dress alone. I showed him the photos from my fitting where the dress was perfect and fitted specifically to me. My dad looked at every single photo and text, and his face got more and more upset. When I finished, he just sat there quietly for a long time. Finally, he said he was sorry, and he knew he'd failed me. He said he'd watched Jade take my things for years, and never stopped it because Heidi would get upset and he didn't want to fight. He admitted that he chose keeping peace in his marriage over protecting me, and he was ashamed of himself. My dad told me that Heidi was pressuring him to convince me to drop the charges. She said Jade made a mistake and didn't deserve to have her whole life ruined over one bad decision. My dad said he refused to do that. He said what Jade did was theft and destruction of property, and she needed to face real consequences for once. He said he'd enabled this behavior by never backing me up when Jade took my things, and now Jade thought she could do whatever she wanted without any repercussions. He told me he supported me completely in pressing charges, and if Heidi couldn't accept that, then they had serious problems in their marriage. I started crying again, and my dad hugged me and said he should have protected me years ago, but he was going to start now. He said no matter what happened with Heidi, he was walking me down the aisle in 12 days and nothing would stop him from being there for my wedding. I drove home from the coffee shop feeling lighter than I had in days, knowing my dad was finally on my side. When I got to my apartment, my phone rang and the caller ID showed the bridal boutique where I'd bought my dress. The consultant said she'd heard through the wedding vendor network what happened and she was so sorry. She offered to help me find a replacement dress but warned me that getting anything altered properly in less than 2 weeks would be nearly impossible since most alterations take at least 3 to 4 weeks for a wedding gown. I thanked her and said I'd start calling other shops to see what options existed. I spent the entire rest of that day on my laptop and phone calling every bridal shop within a 100-mile radius. I explained my situation over and over to different consultants and seamstresses. Every single shop told me the same thing. 2 weeks wasn't enough time for proper alterations on any wedding dress. Some shops didn't even have dresses in stock that would fit me without major alterations. Others had dresses available, but their seamstresses were booked solid for the next month. One shop offered to rush alterations for triple the normal cost, but couldn't guarantee the dress would be ready in time. By evening, I was exhausted and crying again while Luke held me on the couch. He gently suggested we could postpone the wedding by a few months to give me time to find and alter a new dress properly. I immediately said no because we'd already paid deposits on the venue, the catering, the photographer, and the DJ. Our guests had already booked flights and hotel rooms from out of state. I refused to let Jade's actions have that much power over my life and my wedding day. Luke said he understood, and we'd figure something out together. The next morning, Frances called me crying and apologizing for being at Jade's bachelorette party. She explained that Jade had told everyone I approved of her wearing the dress and thought it was sweet. Frances said she felt sick when she realized what was really happening, and that's why she sent me the photos immediately. She offered to testify in court about everything she saw if it would help my case. She also told me that Jade had been bragging all night about how she looked better in my dress than I would have, and how she was going to be the prettier bride. I thanked Frances for the offer to testify, and told her I appreciated her sending the photos, even though seeing them had been awful. Later that afternoon, the insurance adjuster arrived at my apartment to assess the damage to my dress. Jade's friends had returned it in a black garbage bag that they left on Luke's doorstep the morning after her arrest. The adjuster pulled the dress out carefully and laid it across my dining table. He took dozens of photos of the wine stains down the front, the torn vintage lace on the sleeves, the vomit on the train, and the ground-in dirt on the hem. He examined every inch of the dress and made notes on his tablet. Finally, he looked at me and said the dress was a complete total loss, with no possibility of restoration given the extent of the damage. He said he'd file his report that day, and the insurance company would contact me about the payout. 2 days later, my insurance company called to say they'd approved the claim and would pay the full $8,000 replacement value. The agent explained the check would arrive within a week. I thanked her but explained that the money didn't actually solve my problem since I still couldn't find a dress that could be altered in time. The agent mentioned that I could also file a civil lawsuit against Jade for additional damages like emotional distress and the cost of having to potentially postpone my wedding. The next day, Brett called my cell phone and asked if we could meet to talk about what happened. I agreed to meet him at a different coffee shop than where I'd met my dad. When I arrived, Brett was already sitting at a corner table looking tired and upset. He stood up when he saw me and apologized before I even sat down. He told me he'd been doing research on Jade since her arrest and discovered she'd lied about multiple things in their 3-month relationship. I asked what kind of lies, and Brett explained that Jade had told him her family was wealthy, and she had a trust fund, which was why she never seemed to work much or worry about money. He said he'd been fine with that since he made good money at his job and didn't mind paying for their dates. But now he realized she was probably spending money she took from me and living off Heidi instead of having any trust fund. I told Brett about the entire 10-year history of Jade taking my belongings without permission. I explained how she'd steal my clothes and wear them to the school claiming they were hers. I told him about the expensive skincare products she'd use up, the jewelry she'd borrow and never return, and even my prescription retainer she took once. Brett's face got more and more angry as I talked. He admitted he was seeing red flags everywhere now that he knew the truth. He mentioned that Jade had been pressuring him hard to pay for their entire wedding because she claimed her trust fund was temporarily frozen due to some banking issue. Now he understood there never was any trust fund, and she expected him to fund everything while she contributed nothing. He asked me more questions about Jade's behavior over the years, and I answered honestly. By the end of our conversation, Brett looked like he was seriously reconsidering his engagement. He thanked me for being honest with him and said he had a lot to think about. The following morning, the district attorney's office called to schedule a meeting about pressing charges against Jade. The assistant DA explained that with the break-in at Luke's apartment and the $8,000 value of the dress, they were looking at felony burglary and grand theft charges. She said these were serious charges that could result in significant prison time if Jade was convicted. The DA wanted to meet with me to go over my evidence and discuss whether I wanted to proceed with prosecution. I scheduled the meeting for 3 days later, which would be 9 days before my wedding. The next day, Heidi showed up at my office during my lunch break. I was sitting at my desk eating a sandwich when the receptionist called to say someone was here to see me. I walked to the lobby and found Heidi standing there with red eyes and tissues in her hand. She grabbed my arm and started begging me to drop the charges against Jade. She said a felony conviction would ruin Jade's entire life, and she'd never be able to get a decent job or move forward. I pulled my arm away and told her that Jade ruined her own life when she broke into Luke's apartment and stole $8,000 worth of my property. Heidi kept saying it was just a dress and families should forgive each other. I said forgiveness doesn't mean protecting someone from consequences, and I wasn't going to let Jade get away with felony theft just because we're technically related. Heidi started crying harder and said I was being cruel and heartless. I told her she'd enabled Jade's behavior for 10 years, and now Jade was facing real consequences for the first time in her life. Several of my coworkers were staring at us, so I asked Heidi to leave. She refused and kept begging until I threatened to call building security. She finally left but yelled that I'd regret this. That evening, my dad called and said he needed to talk. His voice sounded tired and strained. He told me he and Heidi had gotten into a massive fight after she came home from my office. He said Heidi wanted him to convince me to drop the charges, and when he refused, she accused him of choosing me over his wife. My dad said he told Heidi that he was supporting me completely because what Jade did was criminal and wrong. He said if Heidi couldn't accept that Jade needed to face consequences, then they had serious problems in their marriage. I asked if he was okay, and he admitted things were tense at home, but he wasn't backing down this time. He apologized again for not protecting me better over the years, and said he was proud of me for standing up for myself. 3 days later, I met with the district attorney at her office downtown. She was a woman in her 40s with short hair and a no-nonsense attitude. She spread out papers on her desk and showed me Jade's official statement to the police. I read through it and felt my anger rising again. Jade claimed the dress was family property that belonged to both of us since we were sisters. She said she had every right to borrow it, and I was overreacting by calling it theft. The DA pointed to several other documents showing my receipt with only my name, the text where I told Heidi the dress was off limits, and photos from my fitting appointments. She said Jade's defense wouldn't work because I had overwhelming evidence proving sole ownership. The DA explained that Jade was facing felony burglary for breaking into Luke's apartment and felony grand theft for stealing property worth over $1,000. She said we had a strong case and she was confident about getting a conviction. I asked what kind of sentence Jade might face, and the DA said possibly several years in prison depending on the judge. After the meeting, I felt relieved that the legal system was taking this seriously, but also stressed about my wedding that was now only 6 days away. I met with my wedding planner that afternoon at a coffee shop. She'd heard what happened through the vendor network and wanted to help me find a dress solution. We spent 2 hours going through options. She suggested renting a designer dress from a formal wear shop, but when we called around, nothing was available in my size on such short notice. She brought up buying something off the rack from a department store, but everything we looked at online felt wrong. She even suggested wearing a nice white cocktail dress and calling it a modern wedding look. Nothing felt right, and I started to panic about walking down the aisle in something that wasn't special. The planner could see I was getting upset and promised to keep looking for options. That evening, Luke's mom called and asked if she could come over. When she arrived, she was carrying a large white box. She sat down on my couch and explained that she'd heard about my dress situation from Luke. She opened the box and pulled out her own wedding dress from 30 years ago. It was beautiful ivory lace with long sleeves and a cathedral train. She said she'd kept it preserved all these years, hoping her daughter might want to wear it someday. But she never had a daughter. She asked if I would consider wearing it for my wedding. I was shocked and didn't know what to say. She insisted I try it on, so I went to my bedroom and carefully put on the dress. When I looked in the mirror, I couldn't believe it. The dress fit almost perfectly, except for needing the hem taken up slightly since Luke's mom was taller than me. I walked back to the living room and Luke's mom's eyes filled with tears. She said I looked beautiful and the dress was meant to be mine. I completely broke down crying and hugged her. I told her I couldn't believe she was doing this for me after my own stepmother had enabled the destruction of my dress. Luke's mom held me while I cried and said that family isn't just about blood relations. She said family is about who shows up for you when you need them, and she was honored to be part of my life. She told me the dress only needed minor changes that could be done in less than a week. The next morning, Brett called my cell phone. His voice sounded flat and tired. He said he needed to tell me that he'd broken off his engagement to Jade. I asked what happened, and he explained that he couldn't marry someone who would steal from family and show zero remorse about it. He said when he tried to talk to Jade about what she'd done, she just kept insisting it wasn't a big deal, and I was overreacting. Brett said he realized Jade had no sense of right and wrong and he didn't want to spend his life with someone like that. He apologized again for not seeing through her lies sooner and wished me well with my wedding. About an hour after Brett's call, my phone started going crazy with texts from Jade. She sent message after message blaming me for Brett leaving her. She said I'd ruined her life and destroyed her relationship, and now her wedding was canceled. She claimed I was a terrible person who couldn't stand to see her happy. Not once did she mention that she'd broken into Luke's apartment or destroyed my $8,000 dress. Every text was about how I'd wronged her and ruined everything for her. She sent over 30 messages in less than an hour. I finally blocked her number and took screenshots of every single text message. I forwarded them all to the district attorney, with a note explaining that these showed Jade's complete lack of remorse. The DA responded within minutes, saying these messages were actually helpful to the prosecution because they proved Jade understood what she'd done was wrong, but only cared about how it affected her. The next day, I took Luke's mom's dress to a seamstress who specialized in vintage gowns. When I walked in carrying the dress box, the seamstress looked up and said she'd already heard about what happened to my original dress. She said the story had spread through the entire local wedding vendor community, and everyone was horrified. She carefully examined Luke's mom's dress and said the alterations would be simple. When I asked about the cost, she shook her head and said she wasn't charging me anything. She explained that after hearing what I'd been through, she wanted to help in whatever way she could. I tried to insist on paying, but she refused and said sometimes people just need to help each other. She promised the dress would be ready 3 days before my wedding, with plenty of time for a final fitting. My dad called me that same afternoon and asked if we could meet for coffee the next morning. When I sat down across from him at the cafe, he looked tired and older than I remembered. He said he needed to tell me something important, and then explained he'd told Heidi he wanted them to go to marriage counseling. I asked why now, and he said watching everything unfold with Jade had made him realize how badly he'd failed me as a father. He admitted he'd spent 10 years backing down whenever Heidi defended Jade's behavior because he wanted to keep the peace in our blended family. He said he was ashamed that he'd chosen his marriage over protecting his own daughter, and he couldn't live with himself anymore if he didn't make changes. I told him I appreciated that, but it didn't erase a decade of letting Jade steal from me and destroy my belongings. He nodded and said he knew he couldn't fix the past, but he wanted to try being the father I deserved from now on. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 8 days before my wedding. I had to take time off work to go to the courthouse and testify about what happened. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, with fluorescent lights that made everything look washed out and pale. Jade sat at the defense table in a conservative dress her mom probably picked out, looking nothing like the drunk girl who'd destroyed my wedding dress. Her lawyer was a middle-aged man in a gray suit who kept shuffling papers and whispering to her. When it was my turn to testify, I walked up to the witness stand and swore to tell the truth. The prosecutor asked me to describe what happened the night of the bachelorette party, and I explained finding the photos on my phone, seeing my dress destroyed, going to the club, and confronting Jade. Jade's lawyer cross-examined me and tried to make it sound like a simple misunderstanding between sisters. He asked if Jade had ever borrowed my clothes before, and I said yes, but never by breaking into someone's apartment. He asked if we'd shared things growing up, and I explained that sharing requires permission, which Jade never asked for. He tried to suggest that keeping the dress at Luke's apartment proved I knew Jade wanted to wear it, and I said no. It proved I didn't trust her around my belongings. The prosecutor showed the judge photos of the destroyed dress with all the stains and rips in the vintage lace. She showed the receipt proving I paid $8,000 and the text where I explicitly told Heidi the dress was off limits. She showed the photos from the bachelorette party of Jade wearing it while drinking and dancing. The evidence was overwhelming, and Jade's lawyer couldn't explain away the break-in or the theft. The judge looked at all the evidence and listened to both sides present their arguments. Then he said he found probable cause to believe Jade had committed burglary and grand theft. He set her trial date for 2 months away and explained the charges she was facing. That's when Jade started crying at the defense table with her shoulders shaking and tears running down her face. I think it finally hit her that this was real and she could actually go to jail. Her mom reached over the railing to grab her hand, but the bailiff told her to sit back. Outside the courthouse, after the hearing ended, Heidi came rushing toward me across the parking lot. My dad saw her coming and physically stepped between us before she could reach me. He held up his hand and told her she needed to stop. He said she had to accept that Jade had committed actual crimes, and she needed to stop harassing me, especially with my wedding only days away. Heidi started yelling that I was ruining Jade's entire future over a dress, but my dad said no. Jade ruined her own future by breaking the law. He told Heidi to go home and he'd meet her there later. She stood there for a minute looking shocked that he was taking my side, then finally turned and walked to her car. That evening, Brett called my cell phone again. He said he wanted me to know he'd given a statement to the police about Jade's lies and manipulative behavior during their relationship. He explained that the detective had contacted him asking questions about Jade's character, and he'd been completely honest about everything. He told them how she'd lied about her family being wealthy and having a trust fund. He told them how she'd pressured him to pay for everything. He told them about her pattern of taking things that didn't belong to her and acting like it was normal. Brett said he hoped his statement would help my case, and he apologized again for not seeing through her lies sooner. I thanked him for being honest with the police and told him I appreciated his integrity. 2 days later, my wedding planner called with an update on all the vendors. She confirmed that everyone was still locked in for the wedding despite all the drama that had happened. She said she'd heard through the vendor network about what Jade did, and several vendors had reached out offering support. The wedding planner had rearranged some of the logistics to account for the family tension. She'd created a buffer zone in the seating chart to keep Heidi and Jade away from me if they decided to show up. She'd also briefed all the vendors on the situation so they'd know to alert her if either of them tried to cause problems. That night, Luke and I had a long, serious talk about whether we should uninvite Heidi and Jade from the wedding. Part of me wanted to ban them completely, but another part didn't want to give them that power over my day. We went back and forth discussing the pros and cons for over an hour. Finally, we decided to let them make their own choice about attending, but we were hiring security to remove them immediately if they caused any problems. Luke said he'd already contacted a security company that specialized in wedding events, and they could have 2 guards there. The next afternoon, my dad came over to our apartment. He sat down on the couch and said he needed me to know something. He told me he was coming to my wedding no matter what Heidi decided to do. He said he was walking me down the aisle exactly as we'd planned. He looked me in the eyes and said this was his chance to finally show up for me the way he should have shown up for the past 10 years. I could see he meant it, and I told him that having him there meant everything to me. 3 days before the wedding, Jade's lawyer contacted my lawyer about a potential plea deal. They were offering for Jade to plead guilty to misdemeanor theft instead of felony burglary. In exchange, she'd pay restitution and get probation, and they'd drop the more serious burglary charge. My lawyer forwarded me the offer and said I should think about it carefully. The next morning, I met with the district attorney at her office downtown to discuss the plea offer. She was a woman in her 40s with short dark hair and a no-nonsense attitude. She explained that trials were always unpredictable and juries could be sympathetic to young defendants. She said the plea deal guaranteed that Jade would face some consequences and have to pay me back. She also pointed out that going to trial would mean more time in court and more stress right around my wedding. I asked her what she thought I should do, and she said ultimately it was my decision, but the plea ensured accountability. I told her I needed time to think about it since my wedding was only 3 days away, and I couldn't handle making this decision right now. That night, Luke and I sat at our kitchen table surrounded by wedding seating charts and vendor contracts while I told him about the plea deal offer. He listened without interrupting while I explained the terms they proposed and how the DA said trials were unpredictable. Luke reached across the table and took my hand and said he supported whatever I decided, but pointed out that accepting the deal meant we could move forward without a trial hanging over our wedding and honeymoon. I looked at all the wedding planning materials spread across the table and realized I didn't want to spend the next few months dealing with court dates and testimony. The next morning, I called my lawyer and told her I would accept the plea deal, but only with specific conditions added. I wanted Jade to pay full restitution of $8,000, plus all court costs and complete anger management classes, and stay away from me for at least 1 year with a restraining order. My lawyer said she would contact the DA immediately to propose these terms. 3 hours later, my lawyer called back and said the DA agreed to propose all my conditions to Jade's lawyer. Within 2 more hours, Jade's lawyer called accepting every single term without negotiation. My lawyer explained that Jade was apparently desperate to avoid a felony conviction that would destroy her job prospects, and Heidi was willing to pay the full restitution to make this go away. I felt this weird mix of relief and anger, knowing that Heidi was still enabling Jade by paying her way out of consequences, but at least Jade would have the conviction on her record and mandatory anger management. The day before my wedding, I drove to the seamstress shop for my final fitting on the dress Luke's mom had given me. The seamstress had worked magic on the alterations, and when I put it on, it fit like it was made for me. I stood in front of the mirror looking at myself in this beautiful gown that represented real family love and support, instead of the stolen, destroyed dress that represented years of boundary violations. The seamstress smiled and said I looked perfect and refused again to charge me for the work. That evening, my dad picked me up and took me to a quiet restaurant across town, away from anywhere we might run into Heidi or Jade. We sat in a corner booth and he ordered our food, then looked at me with tears in his eyes. He told me he was sorry for years of choosing peace over protecting me, and for letting Heidi pressure him into removing my door lock, and for not standing up when Jade took my things. He said he was proud of how I stood up for myself, and didn't let Jade's actions destroy my wedding or my life. I told him I was glad he was finally seeing the truth, and that having him walk me down the aisle meant everything to me. My wedding day arrived, and I woke up feeling surprisingly calm despite everything that had happened. Francis and Luke's mom came over early to help me get ready, and the 3 of us laughed and talked while doing hair and makeup. When I put on the dress, it felt right in a way my original dress never had because this one came from people who genuinely cared about me. Francis kept saying I looked beautiful, and Luke's mom had tears running down her face saying I reminded her of her own wedding day 30 years ago. We arrived at the venue, and I peeked out to see the guests gathering, but Heidi and Jade were nowhere to be seen. Part of me had worried they would show up and cause problems, but their absence felt like a relief instead of a disappointment. The music started, and my dad met me at the back of the aisle with tears already streaming down his face. He whispered that he loved me and was so grateful I didn't give up on him despite his mistakes. We walked down the aisle together, and I could see Luke at the altar crying happy tears, and the ceremony was absolutely perfect without any family tension or drama. During the reception, multiple guests came up to me saying they had heard what happened with Jade and the stolen dress. They told me they were amazed I had pulled together such a beautiful wedding despite everything. One of my aunts hugged me and said Jade's attempt to ruin my day had failed completely because I looked happier and more relaxed than any bride she had ever seen. The DJ announced our first dance, and Luke led me onto the floor wearing the dress his mother had worn when she married his father. I looked over and saw Luke's parents crying happy tears while watching us, and I felt surrounded by people who genuinely loved and supported me, instead of people who saw me as a resource to exploit. After our dance, my dad took the microphone for his toast, and the room went quiet. He looked right at me and said he needed to publicly acknowledge that he had failed me as a father by not setting boundaries with Jade and by choosing peace over protection. His voice cracked when he said he was proud of the woman I had become despite his failures, and he promised to do better going forward. He raised his glass and said he was grateful I didn't give up on him, and that he would spend the rest of his life proving he deserved to be called my dad. The room broke into applause after my dad's toast, and several guests came up to hug him while wiping their own tears. Frances caught my eye from across the room and made her way through the crowd toward me. She grabbed my hand and pulled me toward a quieter corner near the windows overlooking the garden. She leaned in close and told me she had something I needed to know about Jade's friends from the bachelorette party. Apparently, every single one of them had completely cut Jade off after finding out about the arrest and seeing the destroyed dress. Frances said the photos had spread through their entire social circle, and people were absolutely disgusted by what Jade did. One of the bridesmaids from that party had even posted on social media about how she felt sick being associated with someone who would steal from family and destroy something so valuable. Frances squeezed my arm and said Jade was facing real social consequences beyond just the legal ones because nobody wanted to be friends with someone like that. I thanked Frances for telling me, and we hugged before she went back to the dance floor. The rest of the reception flew by in a blur of dancing and laughter and cake cutting and bouquet tossing. Luke and I said goodbye to all our guests around 11 at night and climbed into the car that would take us to the airport. As we drove away from the venue, I looked back at the building all lit up and felt this wave of genuine happiness wash over me. Luke reached over and took my hand while I stared out the window at the city lights passing by. I realized that despite everything Jade had tried to do, we didn't postpone anything or let her actions diminish our celebration even a little bit. Our wedding had been absolutely perfect, and she hadn't managed to ruin a single moment of it. We caught a red-eye flight to Hawaii and landed in Honolulu early the next morning with the sun already beating down hot and bright. The hotel had upgraded us to an ocean view suite, and we spent the first day just sleeping off the wedding exhaustion and ordering room service. On the third day of our honeymoon, I was lying on the beach reading a book when my phone buzzed with a text from my dad. I opened it and saw a long message explaining that the plea deal had been finalized in court that morning. Jade had pled guilty to misdemeanor theft, and the judge sentenced her to 2 years probation. She had to pay full restitution of $8,000 plus court costs and complete anger management classes. The best part was the judge issued a 1-year restraining order that legally required Jade to stay away from me. My dad said Jade cried in court, but the judge told her she was lucky to avoid a felony conviction and jail time. I showed Luke the message, and he let out a long breath before pulling me close and kissing the top of my head. Later that same afternoon, I got an email notification from my insurance company. I opened it on my phone and read that my claim had been fully processed and approved. The $8,000 payout would be deposited in my account within 5 business days. Combined with the restitution payment Jade owed me, I was actually going to end up with $16,000 total. The money felt like justice being served in the most concrete way possible. Luke and I spent the rest of our honeymoon swimming in crystal clear water and hiking through rainforests and eating fresh pineapple on the beach. We didn't talk about Jade or the dress or any of the family drama that had consumed the weeks before our wedding. When other couples at the resort asked about our wedding, I told them it was perfect, because it genuinely was, despite all the chaos that led up to it. We got back home 10 days later, tired and sunburned and happy. There was a stack of mail waiting inside our apartment door, and Luke carried it to the kitchen table while I unpacked our suitcases. He called out that there was a letter from a law office, and I came over to look. The return address showed Jade's lawyer's name, and I opened it carefully. Inside was a check for $666.67, along with a payment schedule showing this was the first of 12 monthly installments. A note from the lawyer explained that Heidi was making the payments on Jade's behalf, but the restitution was still Jade's legal responsibility. I stared at that check for a long time, thinking about how Heidi was finally holding Jade financially accountable, even if she had to be the one writing the checks. 2 weeks after we got back from our honeymoon, my dad called and invited Luke and me over for dinner. When we arrived at his house, he looked lighter somehow, like a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. Over dinner, he told us that he and Heidi had started going to marriage counseling twice a week. Their therapist was helping Heidi understand how her constant enabling had hurt both Jade and me over the years. My dad said Heidi was starting to acknowledge her mistakes and admit that she created a monster by never letting Jade face consequences. He told us the counseling was hard and uncomfortable, but necessary if they wanted to save their marriage. I asked if Heidi had said anything about me, and my dad nodded slowly. He said she was ashamed of how she treated me and wanted to apologize eventually, but the therapist told her she needed to do more internal work first. A few days later, I was scrolling through social media when I saw a message request from Brett. I accepted it and read what he wrote. He said he was dating someone new who he met at his gym and wanted to thank me for helping him dodge a bullet with Jade. He explained that Jade had tried contacting him at least 20 times through different phone numbers and social media accounts, but he blocked her completely every time. Brett said his new girlfriend was kind and honest and normal, and he was grateful every day that he found out who Jade really was before marrying her. I sent back a short message wishing him well, and then archived the conversation. 3 months after our wedding, I was grocery shopping on a Saturday afternoon when I turned down the cereal aisle and saw Jade standing there comparing 2 boxes. She looked up and our eyes met and her face went completely white. She immediately put both boxes back and started walking quickly toward the other end of the aisle. I called out her name and she stopped but didn't turn around. I walked up behind her and said calmly that I hoped she was learning from this experience and that maybe someday she would understand why boundaries matter. She nodded without looking at me, and I continued past her to grab the cereal I needed before heading to the checkout. My hands were shaking slightly, but I felt proud that I handled the encounter without drama or anger. That evening, my dad called and asked if I had run into Jade today because she called Heidi crying about seeing me. I told him what happened, and he sighed before telling me something I didn't know. Jade had moved out of Heidi's house a month ago and was living with a roommate in a small apartment across town. She was working full-time at a retail store to pay off her restitution, and it was the first time in her entire life she had to actually support herself without her mother's money. My dad said it had been a real wake-up call for Jade to discover that rent and groceries and bills cost actual money that she had to earn. He told me Heidi was no longer giving Jade any financial help beyond making those restitution payments, and Jade was struggling hard with the reality of being an adult. Luke and I spent the next few weeks unpacking boxes in our apartment and figuring out where everything should go. We established routines like cooking dinner together every night and watching shows on the couch before bed. One evening I was washing dishes while Luke dried them, and I realized I hadn't thought about Jade's betrayal all day. The anger that used to hit me every morning when I woke up had faded into something quieter. Some people just have to learn consequences the hard way, and that wasn't my responsibility anymore. I told Luke what I was thinking, and he kissed my forehead and said he was proud of me for getting to this point. A week later, my dad called and asked if I'd be willing to meet Heidi for coffee if she reached out. I said I would consider it if she contacted me through him and kept it in a public place. He thanked me and mentioned she'd been working really hard in counseling to understand her mistakes. 2 days after that, my dad texted with a date and time for coffee at a shop downtown. I drove there on Saturday morning and found Heidi already sitting at a corner table with 2 cups in front of her. She stood up when she saw me, and her eyes were red like she'd been crying. We sat down, and she immediately started apologizing for enabling Jade and dismissing my feelings for years. Tears ran down her face while she talked about how the counseling helped her see that she created an entitled person who hurt everyone around her. She said she was ashamed of how she treated me, and knew sorry wasn't enough but wanted to start somewhere. I listened to everything she said, and then told her I appreciated the apology, but needed time before rebuilding any relationship with her. She nodded and wiped her eyes and said she understood completely. She told me she needed to earn back my trust through actions, not just words, and she was willing to do whatever that took. We finished our coffee and I left feeling like maybe something could eventually heal between us. 6 months after my wedding, my dad invited Luke and me to dinner at his house. When we arrived, Heidi was there helping set the table, but she didn't try to hug me or act like everything was fine. She greeted us politely and asked if we wanted drinks, then went back to the kitchen. During dinner, she was respectful of boundaries and didn't bring up Jade or make excuses for anything. My dad talked about work, and Luke shared stories about his job, and Heidi listened without trying to control the conversation. Jade wasn't invited, and nobody mentioned her absence. It wasn't perfect, and there was still tension in the room, but it was progress. I felt proud of myself for standing firm on consequences while leaving room for eventual healing. When we left that night, I hugged my dad and nodded at Heidi, and she smiled sadly and said thank you for coming. The drive home felt lighter than I expected.